Welcome back to the CritMedic podcast. I'm your host, Dominic Wallenczak, and today we're going to talk about the past, present, and future of EMS. No big thing. So where does the future of EMS go exactly? What does the professional roadmap for EMS look like? Well, this is sort of where our professional course has gone over the past several decades to centuries. And I've put a little compilation together here for you. So it's really difficult to say exactly, when we began. But what we can tell is that we're not really a new profession. We've been around for actually hundreds of years. There was documented cases of diphtheria patients or cholera patients in London being ushered to the hospital by ambulance, I think as early as the 14th or 15th century. Actually, maybe it was as late as the 16th century. But it never really took off until a certain point in time. So we're not exactly a new profession, but perhaps our real takeoff point may have been more recent. So it's really hard to pick an exact point, but what I came up with was this. Year zero. So what exactly took place during year zero? Well, during year zero, we had things that were established prior to this date, but this was really when things like registration and credentialing really started, and it was enacted in several states, and other states took off shortly thereafter. So different states enacted their regulations at different times. So we gradually developed, and we had a marker at year 6. So what happened in year 6? Well, in year 6, the University of Minnesota bestows the first bachelor's degree in paramedicine, which is a pretty exciting development. So moving forward, a couple years later, in year 14, there was a standardized curriculum established by the National Association of EMS Educators. Moving ahead now, it's 51 years from that initial date, and the first paramedic PhD program was offered at the University of Pittsburgh. So moving forward, year 62, there was an advanced practice paramedic program that was developed at the University of Colorado. Year 68, and there's an associate's degree that's required for new paramedics. Year 114. There's a law requiring bachelor's degree for paramedics within 10 years enacted. This seems a little bit fishy, doesn't it? I don't recall ever hearing of anything about this, but I do have one little confession that I must make. And that is, yep, that's right, I lied. So this is not exactly talking about the EMS profession. This is talking about nurses. So nurses, this is the history of nursing. And nurses have been around for quite some time. It's considered to be one of the oldest professions. But really around 1919, I believe, is the year when nursing first started to become regulated and credentialing was a requirement. And this was really done at the impetus and created by nurses. Nurses came together into a big congress of other fellow nurses and nursing organizations and laid the ground rules for the credentialing process and lobbied the regulators to make this. So this is from day one, this was a grassroots effort to create nursing as a profession. And really from the get-go, they've had advanced degrees like bachelor's degree, and then eventually they backtracked a bit and said, well, because of a nursing shortage, we're also going to have a associate's degree nurse career path as well. There were some certificate nurses as well that stayed around as sort of a legacy grandfather position, but associate's degree was pretty much university required, and nowadays it's to the point where BSN is a requirement. So unfortunately, this talk was really started off by talking about nursing as a profession. So what does EMS look like? What are some EMS accomplishments as a profession? Well, let's take a look at the EMS profession actually. Year zero, which is also known as 1865. So there were civilian-run ambulances that were established, with the first hospital-based ambulance started in Cincinnati. Granted, there's a picture of a Bellevue Hospital ambulance, but it's the same general concept. And this spread to several cities. Horse-drawn carriage with a physician on board. Now, this is not paramedics. This is not really EMS per se as we know today. But this is the first ambulance service that we can really identify with and say this is the first civilian ambulance service in widespread use. There's also ambulances in use during the Civil War, which were a little bit less developed. There were more of what are akin to sort of ambulance attendants that take them to the field surgical tents in the Civil War. So this is really year zero. So march ahead 34 years, or to the year of 1899, we now have a development EMS. We have a horseless ambulance introduced at Micro Ruiz Hospital in Chicago. And granted, this is a later picture, but the point is the same, that we started to advance EMS by really just advancing our transport means. So fast forward to year 54, also known as 1919. So 1919, we've had several advancements, including the inventions by a gentleman named Marconi. Specifically, two-way radios were introduced. That's right, the wireless telegraph was placed on ambulances to dispatch them more effectively. Now, this is obviously a later model than 1919, but the picture is the same. For the longest point in time, EMS was defined by, the latest advancement of oxygen being on board and having a radio on board to dispatch the ambulances. And that was the most that we really had to offer. So, 101 years later, we finally get into something in 1916, and that was the accidental death and disability, the neglected disease of modern society. And this, many people would say, was the catalyst for EMS as a profession. This highlighted some of the shortcomings of the public health system when it comes to emergency services, and really drove the development of EMS systems, widespread throughout America. So what this looked like is in the year 107, better known as 1972, we've got several developments of paramedic programs being started. I believe this is a picture of one of the first paramedic programs in the U.S. And there was also a residency program started in emergency medicine at the University of Cincinnati, because they realized that, well, maybe just your general practice family practitioners aren't really specialized in handling emergency situations. It's a different environment, and so therefore a different specialty, an emergency specialty, was born, and paramedicine was born right along with it. Also, paramedicine really became popular on TV shows like Emergency, which featured the exploits of Johnny and Roy, and that really cemented itself into the American culture and psyche. So the year 153 rolls around, better known as 2018. So, as you're obviously aware, 2018 is this year. So what developments did we have this year that are notable for the EMS profession? Well, that's when we first had us being defined as something other than advancement in our means of transport, and that was this. There was a joint position paper put out by the International Association of Flight and Critical Care Paramedics, the National Association of EMS Educators, and the National Management Association. And that was this position paper essentially saying, to paraphrase, hey, maybe we should require some degrees, huh? So, granted, that's a bit of an oversimplification, but they lay out a roadmap, and they're targeting, a future date to say, hey, maybe we should have all paramedics requiring to have a degree by this point. It's actually a good read, and I'd highly recommend that you all take a look at it, because I think this lays out a fundamental roadmap for where our profession needs to go in the future. So, the year 160, also known as the year 2025. This was the date that was specifically referenced in the position paper on saying when we need degrees. So what does the future of EMS look like at that point? Well, it doesn't really look like anything. That's because, as you're all aware, the future isn't quite written yet, and it's up to us to be able to adopt the policies that were outlined in the joint position statement that really pave the way for EMS to be, respected providers and practitioners in the field of pre-hospital care. Now, you're probably wondering what this might look like. Well, we can really look to Canada, the UK, and Australia as an example and a role model for what that profession would look like. They have a couple of features, including self-governance, which is an important factor. They're able to determine for themselves their own policies and rules and aren't dependent upon others. And in addition to this, they have their own college, a professional college, and they're viewed as, professional providers. In the United States, that's not really the case, and the federal government doesn't define paramedicine or EMS as an actual profession. That's because they don't view it as having the requirement of, additional education that's typically required of a profession. In fact, I believe New York State considers it a middle-skilled labor position. So really, at present, EMS is mostly a skilled labor position. And we're looking to move forward and into a bona fide recognized profession. So right now, there is no across-the-board universal requirement for a degree in EMS. And, I think that is partially what is hampering us. So probably what you may be wondering is, well, Dominic, you don't have a degree either, which is actually very true. It may come as a surprise to learn that I don't have my associate's degree in paramedicine. And I don't really have a good excuse. Really, all that would be required in addition would be a math class and a gym class, and I believe perhaps one English class as well. But I have to double check on my specific requirements for my program. So that's not a lot of course load that I need to do in addition to achieve that. But I've been having a difficult time justifying that from an expense standpoint when there's really no benefit to be gained at present. There's no requirement for it as a profession, so there's really no drive for me to get it. I'll ultimately, accomplish that, but it's not something that's high on my list, because right now there is no mandate, there is no requirement to do this. But it's something that we as a profession overall should all come together and agree upon that this is something that we need to look at in the future going forward. But so that outlines where we are and where we've been. So I want you to take a look. I'll put the link for the position paper down in the description for this podcast here, and hopefully you can take a look and really get a read of that, because it has a lot of very valid points, and it's a little bit too long to cover just in this time frame. But go ahead and take a look at the joint position statement, and hopefully you get a picture of what EMS in the future looks like. Well, until next time, keep thinking differently.